Michelle so much for that, for what you did for my soul, for my heart. I know the hearts of many that were in here. Don't forget tonight is our big life group kickoff. We're actually starting the life groups next week. We're going to kind of push that a little more this year because we believe in them, and we think that there's a lot of power in those. We have a lot of members here that are here because of the life groups, and there have been a lot of people whose lives have been touched because of the life groups, myself included. When we first got our boys, our life group is what got us through. Not just in encouragement, but financially. They got together and helped us with things that we couldn't do on our own, and we couldn't have done it without them. So we want you to be involved with those for your benefit. We think they're a great thing. Tonight's the kickoff event here. Last year we did it in Moraine Park and had an epic adult-youth volleyball match, and we can redo that tonight. That'll be fun. Maybe some kickball, and it'll be a covered dish kind of thing, or potluck, whatever you want to call it. Probably depending on your age. So if you can bring something, that's great. If you can't, that's fine. Don't let that stop you from coming. 6 o'clock tonight at the church. Now, if you want to, I think it'll be helpful for you to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11, the 11 and 12 area. That's where we'll be spending our time today. And you don't have to. Most of the verses will be up there, but there are a few verses that I will just have the references on the screen, and then I will read from the scripture. It may help for you to be there. It just may help you to follow along the main topic that we'll be talking about today in Hebrews chapter 11, which is this, the cloud of witnesses. We started the first week. We talked about faith and reason in our series on this chapter. We talked about how God doesn't ask you to leave your brain outside the door when you come in to be a Christian, but rather beckons you to pick it up. That indeed your faith has grown because of your thinking and because of your reason. That faith and reason aren't contradictory and aren't put against each other, but faith and sight are put against each other. That we don't live because of our senses and by what we see and by what we feel. But we live by what we believe to be true, by the promises of God. Then the next week we talked about living by faith. We focused on Abraham and Moses and the two big decisions that they each had to make in deciding whether or not God was worth it for them, and the things that God was promising, whether or not those things were worth it. And then if they actually thought that God was faithful and trustworthy, if they thought God was going to come through with His promises, and about how really we all too must answer those same questions, not just once in our life, but throughout our lives. And then today, our topic is this one, the cloud of witnesses, which of course comes from the first couple of verses of the next chapter in Hebrews chapter 12. Now, there are some times in some chapters in the Bible that are divided. They really shouldn't be divided where they're divided, because it's continuous thought, a continuous idea, and it tries to break it up. This is one of them. Hebrews chapter 12, the first couple of verses, should really go in chapter 11. It's the same idea. And this is what we have here. After giving this hall of fame of faith that he's been given and some stuff that we'll go back over today, he says, therefore, since we are surrounded by those great people, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, often, for whatever reason, we kind of see faith as a thing, as a substance that we can kind of measure or contain. The idea that faith is something that we have or that we don't have, that we have some of, we have more of, that it's a thing that God gives us that we either have or we don't have. But this chapter makes it clear that what faith is not at all a substance that God gives you, that you can have some of or more of, but that faith is the entire life, the entire foundation of everything that a Christian does. Of the way a Christian lives, of the way a Christian loves, of the way a Christian lives life. That it is not just a substance that we hope to have and that we long to have like these people in Hebrews 11, but it is the very foundation of the very life that we live as Christians. We're getting this picture here in Hebrews 11, not at all of these people who have this kind of substance that we wish we had more of, but of these people who are living the life that we as Christians too live. Now, the letter to the Hebrews is written for a reason. Okay, there are people in this time, the early Christian church, very fragile group that it was. They were leaving Christianity and going back to Judaism, going back to other things. They were wavering, kind of getting away from the confession that they made strong to Christ. They weren't sure anymore. They were facing hard times. They were facing persecution. They were facing suffering. People were trying to convince them to go back to Judaism. Now, Judaism was where the real answer was. So in the first part of the book, Paul, whoever writes Hebrews, spends a lot of time, a lot of effort explaining that Jesus is better. Jesus is better than the angels, he says. He's better than the high priest. He's better than Moses and the prophets. He is better. And all those things you're wanting to go back to, all those things you're thinking about going back to, Jesus is better than all of those. Why in the world would you ever want to leave Christ? Why would you ever want to leave the thing that is better to go back to the thing that is lesser, and the thing that is not as good. And now he comes here in Hebrews 11 with these illustrations of these people who are not wavering, but instead who are facing these insurmountable odds that they're facing and who have taken them head on because of their faith. Paul's saying, listen, I know you're facing hard times. I know you're struggling. I know people are trying to get you to leave. But you're not facing anything that people haven't faced before. I know it's hard sometimes to have faith because of the things that this world is going to offer you, because of the thing that this world is going to do to you. I know it's difficult right now to have faith. I know it's difficult right now to be a Christian. But think about this, he says. Think about this. By faith, Abel. By faith, Abel. He says, by faith, Abel looks at his brother, who's giving this offering, this sacrifice. It's not as good as he could give. Not his best stuff. And he looks at his flock, his sheep, and he wants to keep his best ones. He didn't want to give his best ones away. And he sees his brother getting away with not giving his best, just kind of going through the motions. He can do the same thing, but he doesn't. By faith. By faith, Enoch walks with God, lives with God, is taken up with God in a culture that is so bad that the next chapter, God says it is so corrupt that I'm going to destroy it all. And he does with the flood. By faith, Noah wakes up day after day after day after day. Not for a week, not for a month, not for a year, but for 100 years. For a century, doing the same back-breaking, hand-tearing, monotonous, boring work over and over and over again, day after day, for 100 years of doing this boat. All his friends and the people that he loved just mocked him and persecuted him, made fun of him for this ridiculous thing that he believed that God had said to him. By faith, Abraham leaves everything that is comfortable, leaves his home that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, leaves the things that he had set up, his roots, his foundation, his comfortability, and instead decides to follow God. By faith, Sarah, being 90 years old and having been barren her entire life, never had been able to have a child, and now she's too old to have a child, but she believes God so much that she lays with her husband because she knows that God's going to give her a child. By faith, Abraham takes the very thing, the very person he loves more than anything else in the world, and sacrifices it to God, offers it up to God, to the point of about to be plunging a knife into his son's chest. By faith, Isaac and Jacob and Joseph lay on their deathbeds about to pass on, and what they spend their time doing is laying a foundation for the people that are going to come after them to live and follow God. By faith, Moses' parents take their son at a time that is a threat for their torture and their death. When all the sons were being killed, being offered to Egypt, they were killing all these sons because of the prophecy that was made. They took him and hid their son because they knew God was going to do something great with him at the threat of their own life. By faith, Moses left the entire world, everything he could ever have wanted, because of God. Said, listen, instead of having the pleasures of this world and not having Christ, I'll take being mistreated and having Christ instead. By faith, Moses goes back to Egypt and trusts that God is actually going to send the plagues. That every time he goes to Pharaoh and says God's going to do this, he trusts that God is actually going to do it. And he trusts that when he holds the staff over the water, that the Red Sea is going to part. And then he trusts that God is going to take him and his people to the promised land. By faith, the Israelites walk around the city every day for 7 days. And on the seventh day, they walk around 7 times. And they blow some trumpets and yell, because this is what God has told them to do to make the walls fall. By faith, Rahab lets spies into her very city, into her homeland, who want to destroy it because they are the people of God. The next verse, in verse 32, Hebrews chapter 11, he continues. He says, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and dens and in caves of the earth. And that's just the stuff he decides to mention. He could have talked for chapters about each one of those characters. But he takes a second and says, listen, you think it's hard? I know that you're wavering, you're thinking about going back to Judaism. Think about these people who by faith went up against insurmountable odds. And because of that faith, they lived. He says, listen, Hard things aren't a reason to give up your faith. It's precisely what your faith is there for. It's precisely the proof of your faith. It's why the faith is there. Not so that in hard times you can turn back to what you knew previously, but so that in hard times the faith can hold you strong. He's shouting to them, it doesn't matter what you face. It doesn't matter what you're going through. It doesn't matter the pain that you're feeling, that your God is better. And that your God is stronger. And your God is worth it. I didn't mention this, but that was the first point, which is who. Okay, the who of chapter 11, the who of chapter 12. And the second point, the how. We see amazing pictures. These people of faith, these men and women of God, what they did by faith, what they endured by faith in chapter 11. How are they doing that? How are they getting their feet so set in the rock that is the promises of God? How are they living their life in the foundation so well that is God and Christianity? Number one, they trusted the promises of God. It's kind of hinting back to what we talked about last week. They trusted the promises of God. And we talked about each of these people, not just Moses and Abraham, each one comes to this massive moment of decision where they got to decide who they're going to be, what they're going to stand for in their life. They have to decide whether or not they really think that God is worth it. Is this God, this Christianity stuff, really worth them having to give up for this? And then, do they really think that God is trustworthy or faithful? Is he really going to come through with what he has promised that he will come through with? A chapter earlier in Hebrews chapter 10, Paul says this. He says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. And leading into this chapter 11. Let us hold fast our confession. Hold fast your confession of faith, your Christianity. Why? Because he who promised is faithful. Because the one who made you the promises that he has made you is faithful. Listen, God has made you some great promises. He has promised you your salvation in response to your faith. He's promised you that he will never leave you nor forsake you here. That he's with you every step, every breath that you breathe on earth. He's promised you a new body that's going to blow your mind in heaven. He's promised you that he is sovereign, that he's in control of everything that happens. He has promised you that all the things that happen to you work out for your good. The real question is, do you believe him? And Paul says, trust me, that God who has made you these promises, these amazing, incredible, hard to believe promises, that God is faithful. That God will come through. Number two, they considered themselves strangers and exiles. Here's that passage that Peter read very well a minute ago, starting in verse 13. In the middle of the chapter, he stops and says, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. They defied the wisdom of the world. Here's the truth. Your default setting on your heart, right, the way that you're made initially, is get mine today. That's how you're born. That's how you wake up every morning. Today, get mine. I need to do what I need to do. I want to do what I want to do. Today, I'm going to get mine. That's your default setting. Let's focus on today. Let's focus on me. They said, no. Here's what we're going to do, actually. We're going to focus on the future. We're going to focus on what's coming to us. Despite this insurmountable odds that we're facing, despite these hardships, we're going to look forward to the massive amount of glory and happiness and joy that is coming. And instead of looking inward at me, we're going to look outward at others. Instead, they lived in the present in light of the future. And they handled everything that is visible in light of the invisible. You hear that? They handled everything that is visible. Everything that happens to you today in this physical world in light of and in thought of and within their mind, the invisible. The things that to them were actually the real things. The invisible things. Author, theologian Sinclair Ferguson says it like this about this chapter. He says, the key to their living by faith was not to live by what they could see, feel, and touch on the basis of our senses, but to live on the basis of what God has said and promised. That is faith. That is faith. To live on the basis of what God has said and what God has promised. Not just blind hope, hoping that what you want to be true is true, but living on what God has promised because you trust that God is faithful, because you trust that God is telling you the truth, because you trust that God is going to come through with what he promised you. Third one. God was enough for them. God was enough for them. Look at the end of this. We read over it, but I want you to focus on this just for a second. after he gets done naming them each, he says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith," listen to these great things, "conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection." You hear all these great things that happen by faith? Escaping the edge of the sword, stopping the mouths of lions, receiving back the dead by resurrection. How great faith is. What great things faith can bring you. But unless you stop there and think that that's really the reason for faith, he continues. He says, "Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, and mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, in dens and caves of the earth." Something I noticed the other day when I was reading with Ariel that I hadn't noticed before is that in the first section it specifically says that they escaped the edge of the sword by faith. In the second section it specifically says that by faith they died by the sword. That by faith they didn't get away from the sword. That because of their faith the sword was there to kill them. See, here's the question. Is God enough for you? Because for them, God obviously was enough. Get a little more practical. Why do you want God? Why is it that you're a Christian? Why do you want to have faith? Is it just so faith can bring you good things? Is it just so that faith can help you escape the edge of the sword? Is faith in your eyes, is God in your eyes a means to an end? Is accepting God, accepting Christianity, accepting faith a means to you having a good life? Or is God and faith the end in itself? Because listen, if faith is just a means to escaping the sword, then when it comes time to take on the sword by faith, you're going to have a tough time with that faith. Because God, listen, like Brother Wayne always said, God never promised a smooth sailing. He only promised a safe landing. Things aren't going to go well for you all the time here. As a matter of fact, precisely because of your faith, things are going to get kind of tough. And that's what he's saying. The question for you and the question for me is God enough? One of the songs I love we get from Corinthians talks about your grace is enough. Your grace is enough for me. I have to ask myself every time I sing that, do I really believe that? Do you really believe that God's grace, that God himself is enough for you? That if you lost your job, that if you lost your financial security, that if you lost your home, listen, that if you lost your loved ones, if you lost your children, everything that God has brought you, would God still be enough? Would God still be enough for you if you lost everything else? Yesterday, we had an amazing seminar, a grief seminar, that was really focused on parents who had lost children. I haven't lost a child, but I was there and I was crying just being there, and how powerful and how deep of a pain that these parents had felt. Here's the truth: is that I'm not sure the answer for me right now with this. I'm gonna stop preaching to be honest for a second. I'm not sure if God's enough for me yet. I haven't had a lot of suffering in my life yet. I haven't had a lot of pain yet. The people that were sitting in that grief seminar have. You guys who have faced a lot of grief in your life have had to answer the question, is God still enough? From even what has been taken out of my life and what's been ripped out of my life that God could have stopped, is he still enough for me? Of course, you know, God made Abraham answer that question. You know the way that he answered it. And God praised him for it. Paul wants you to know that these witnesses thought faith was enough. Thought that grace was enough. Thought that God and himself was enough. Listen, faith is going to bring you great things. It absolutely will, but faith is going to bring you also into some terrible things. And the reason you have that faith is to get you through it. That's why it's there. Not to help you escape it, but to help you get through it. To help you endure it by Christ. Last one. Talks about who. Talk about how. Talk about him. Which gets us to our verse for today, which is Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. How he ends really his section. He's been talking about this Hall of Fame of faith. He says, therefore, since we are surrounded by all these great people of faith, who have lived by faith, who have suffered by faith, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to, what's it say? Looking to Jesus. Remember I told you that the whole theme of Hebrews is that Jesus is better? He's better than the angels, he says. Better than the high priest, better than Moses, better than the prophets. He's better than Judaism. Jesus is better. He doesn't stop that theme here. He continues it and says, listen, not only is Jesus better than all those things, Jesus is better than the Hall of Famers. Jesus' faith is better even than their faith. The founder and perfecter of our faith is Jesus. That is actually all ending with Jesus. Not only was he the most faithful that has ever lived, listen, not only is he the most faithful that's ever lived, he's really the only faithful one. The only truly faithful one that's ever lived. The one that made all of their faith legitimate. That made all of their faith and all of our faith worth anything. Because listen, we talked about these great people and how they trusted the promises of God, right? Did they? Absolutely. Sometimes. There's also times when Abraham lied over and over about his wife, saying that she was his sister. Because he heard God promising that he was going to take care of her. That obviously wasn't enough for him. They considered themselves strangers and exiles on the earth. The second point, yeah, they did. Sometimes. Other times, David felt like he needed something so badly in this moment on earth and the earthly pleasure that it would bring that he killed a man in order to get his wife. Is it true as well that God was enough for them? Yeah, sometimes. There's also times where Samson, a man mentioned here later in the chapter, marries a woman that God told him not to. Because that was more important to him. Here's the truth. You want to know why Christ is called the perfecter of our faith? You want to know why our faith needs perfecting? Because it's little. Because it's flawed. Because it'll never be perfect. Because there'll be times where we trust God and His promises, and there'll be times where we just don't. There'll be times where we think about heaven and the things that are in front of us, and because of that, we endure things now, and there'll be times that we don't. And there'll be times when God is worth it for us, and there'll be times where He's not. So God sends Jesus. Not to just be the ending of this faith chapter, the greatest example of faith, but to be really the only one that had the faith. To be really the only one who did trust truly the promises of God. To be really the only one who did look forward to heaven instead of the pain he was facing on earth. To be really the only one who really thought that God was good enough. To be really the only one that found God worth it and worthy and good enough for Him. Listen, praise God that it's not up to you and me to have perfect faith. Praise God that it's not up to you and me to trust God's promises perfectly, to seek the homeland perfectly, to think God is enough perfectly, because Christ did it for you. What we have in Christianity is Christ calling you, saying, listen, I want you to have faith, but your faith is never going to be good enough, so trust in my faith. Because here's the truth. Christ's faith, good enough. So Christ calls out to you and says, trust in my faith. Lean on me, lean on my faith. Know that my perfect faith counts for you. That's a beautiful thing. Hebrews 12:3, we talked about sufferers. Christ was the greatest sufferer of them all. The only good person ever really suffered. You hear people say, why do good things happen to bad, or bad things happen to good people? It only really happened once. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. This Bible, this book here, closing up, it's good news, right? The gospel. It's what the good news is what it means. Not good advice. It's not just, hey, I think you should do this to be good for your life, like advice is. This is news. This is something that happened. It happened. And we're just here to tell you that it happened. That's what it is. This is not our opinion on how you should live life better. This is news about something that happened throughout history and significantly 2,000 years ago. This is not primarily a how-to book telling you how to get to heaven. This is a book that gives you the news that your salvation and your perfected faith has been done for you if you believe it. This is not a book primarily telling you how to get to heaven. This is a book that tells you the news, that gives you the news that your salvation and your perfect faith that you could never do good enough has been done for you. Hallelujah. If there's anything at all we can do for you, that's what the church is about. It's what life groups are for. That's what we're here for. We're here for each other. We're here to worship God, to lift one another up to God, to build one another up. Because we all need it, because we're living through this suffering. We're living through this kind of lacking faith that we all have. Wishing that we all had more of it, as if it was a substance. Is there anything all we can do for you? Please come while we stand and while we sing. Everyone needs compassion.